Okay, this question is asking the author of passage 1 would probably agree with which of the following statements about the interpretation of Walden offered in passage 2. Okay, well, it's important to keep in mind that passage 1 and passage 2 here have very, very different opinions, right? Passage 1 sees industrialization as an intrusion into pastoral harmony. So basically, he's seeing it as a kind of a negative force, not necessarily good. So, that's passage 1, and then passage 2 is saying that Thoreau felt kind of, well, it says downright enthusiastic in line 3 about mechanization. So passage 1 says it's a negative force, right? Passage 2 is saying that Thoreau was excited about it, right? So those are completely different. And now this question is asking you, what would they agree with, right? So you're going to have to find an answer that kind of fits, that kind of can be twisted a little bit, because it's going to be hard to find something that passage 1 and passage 2 kind of agree with. So let's look at A. A says it exaggerates the destructive power of the machine. So does the interpretation of Walden offered in passage 2 exaggerate the destructive power of the machine? No, actually it would exaggerate the right? So like it's the opposite. The passage 2 is saying that industrialization is a good thing, right? So it definitely, passage 2 definitely does not exaggerate the destructive power, right? So I would go against A. Let's go to B. It is overly influenced by the long-standing American worship of nature. I don't think, right, I don't like the word overly influenced, right? Because nowhere in passage 1 did he make a statement like people are too obsessed with nature, right? Or they care too much about nature. He does say that America has a long-standing worship of nature, but that doesn't mean that Walden is overly influenced by that, right? It never says that. So let's go to C. It is not representative of the way Walden is often taught in schools. Well, I like this one, right? Because the interpretation of Walden in passage 2 is that basically Thoreau was excited about industrialization. And passage 1 would definitely say, well, that's not how it's taught in schools, right? In schools, it's taught that Thoreau was actually seeing industrialization as threatening, right? So, yeah, passage 1 would say that about the interpretation of Walden in passage 2. Let's go to D. It overlooks Thoreau's enthusiasm in Walden for the railroad. Well, the interpretation of Walden offered in passage 2 doesn't overlook Thoreau's enthusiasm, right? Because it actually says he's enthusiastic about it. So definitely not D. And E, it is more in accord with the way Walden was generally understood in Thoreau's time than it is currently. Yeah, I mean, passage 1 doesn't really talk about about Walden having a different interpretation in the past versus it having a new interpretation in the present. So I think E is meant to sound good, but really that was never mentioned in the passage. Whereas C, right, it does talk about how Walden is taught in schools. Passage 1 says that right now in schools it's taught that Thoreau saw industrialization as being threatening, and that is the opposite of what passage 2 is saying, so I do like C. Passage 2 is not representative of the way Walden is often taught in schools. Yeah, that's a good answer.